Hello and welcome to another episode of the Wavemakers Podcast, where we feature the stories of the leaders at the intersection of the maritime, decarbonization, and digital transformation. Usually people talk about the companies, the roles, but here we want to take a little bit of a different view and listen to their personal journeys and what drives them. My guest today has held multiple director roles in some of the largest logistics companies and then transitioned to supply green fuel for them. So today, please join me in welcoming Gary Hubbard.
Gordana, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining. And usually I did do a quick intro and then I ask you to share how you see yourself.
Oh, then you're asking the wrong person. You should have invited my wife.
Huh?
She is the best person to tell you how anybody sees me. I guess, yeah. I mean, the most important thing I think is to be, to be a husband. 25 years we've been married now this year. To be a father of two sons, which I think you should always be proud of your children wherever they are, whatever they do. I think, from a career perspective, I've been very fortunate. I'm British by birth. I grew up in England, and that's where we took our education, and that's where we started our careers. I was very fortunate in the early portions of my career to work for what companies are now market leaders. So in the logistics industry, for the likes of DHL, before they were DHL. In the maritime industry, the heady days of P&O Nedlloyd in London. Before we became AP Moller Maersk, a heritage I think we both probably share.
Yeah.
And when you work for global organizations, you get to travel a lot. You get to experience a lot of different cultures, meet a lot of great people who become friends over your life. And I think how you see yourself is possibly a reflection of how the friendship groups around you and the journey you've been on. And I think at the end of the day, if you're happy in where you are at any point in time, that's got to be a good thing.
Yes, when you now were sharing about that, I also know that you worked in majority of the continents of the world, and probably you share this experience where I found myself learning about myself through different cultures and by being exposed to different countries, their cultures, their habits, different ways of how people interact and react, and that made me every time question some of my beliefs and inherited beliefs, and that was a fun journey.
It's very true. I think I always used to say that having a family, we lived in the villages, in the small parts of England, but we worked in the cities. And those cities could be New York, they could be Shanghai, they could be Beijing, they could be Constantinople, they could be anywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. And I think when you work for an organization that gives you the benefit of a global role for a corporate head office and effectively sends you out on projects to North America, to South America, to South Africa, the people you meet, the cultures you become exposed to, they shape you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think they give you a great tolerance, which you don't always see these days, to be honest. I think they give you a good appreciation of the global scale and the impact the maritime industry has, the supply chain industry has, the impact we have on the environment. And all of these things kind of, bring me, I suspect, to where I am now in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. Usually I also ask people, okay, what was your journey into shipping? For you, it was not directly, but then...
It wasn't, you're right. I mean, I started out in manufacturing and supply chain. So traditionally warehousing and distribution on a domestic level, then a European level. And I recall my first day at P&O Nedlloyd in London in what was then Beagle House. And they had employed me to bring land-based logistics skills to the international maritime supply chain, as many organizations were doing in the early 2000s. And they had said in the first few months, we'll keep you in Europe. That's what you're very familiar with. This is where we have a weakness. You can support us in our growth. I walked in the office on day one, and a lovely young lady took my passport, and I assumed it was to register me in their systems. 5 days later, it came back to me with a Chinese visa in it. And on Monday, she said, "You're going to China." So, well, forgive me, my geography is not strong, but that's not in Europe, is it? And that was it, and that's really where it began. I recall we flew into Hong Kong on a very late flight, ran through the airport to get what used to be called Dragon Air, which is really showing my age now, a flight to Shanghai, and I spent the next fortnight in Shanghai, being completely immersed in early 2000s China, when that was such a passionate and again a heady atmosphere to be accepted into the maritime industry, with port tours and going onto vessels and meeting clients who had way much more knowledge about the maritime supply chain than I did at that time. But that was my first dipping my toes in the maritime ocean. That was when it began.
And how was that moment for you? And I think that China was still at that point relatively closed, and getting to become more accepting of internationals coming. And I think that was this first wave then when they were bringing international people.
It really was. And I think what I loved about the welcome I received in those early days as this relatively young, relatively naive young man who hadn't really been much further than Europe, other than for vacation, was that they were so accepting of the concepts. Europe was a very mature logistics infrastructure, whereas Asia really wasn't. And again, it was in those early days, and which I'm not actually proud of now, if I'm honest with you, but it was in those early days of international offshoring. Everybody wanted a new pair of David Beckham's football boots. They wanted a new T-shirt. They wanted a new Armani suit. And of course, these things were being made in Asia, being put into container ships, being moved 3/4 of the way around the world to be sold in our high streets. So now I look at that and think we were creating, the environmental challenges we've got now. We were a significant part of encouraging people to do that. But at the time, it really was about streamlining supply chains, speed to market, launches of new products, how the maritime supply chain could support that cost effectively, robustly. It was a really exciting time. And I don't regret a single moment of those days in Asia. Again, the energy that generated is kind of what the Middle East has now. It's that same innovation, that same energy that unfortunately many parts of the world just don't seem to have anymore.
And was there any interesting moment, an interesting lesson or advice that you learned at that point that you remembered later on?
Yeah, I think things I learned were the obvious ones: how to use chopsticks, something I'm very proud of to this day. Things I tried to learn but never mastered was how to get the meat out of a crab. A Shanghai crab being one of the delicacies, certainly then and now, and I could never master that, that's for sure. I think what amazed me the most was the different cultures. We had a lot of Australasians from both New Zealand and mainland Australia in Asia at that time, because clearly that was the nearest, almost semi-westernized market. So I think, working with those cultures, which can be very direct, very honest, very forthright in their opinions, for a reasonably reserved British person, that can be a moment of shock. I have to say, you have to embrace these things. I think it gives you clarity of discussion, and it allows things to move at a pace which again supports the excitement. You're not dancing, you're running, but you're running together, and you're all after the same ambition, the same aim, the same target that you're all trying to achieve. So I think, if anything, it was the acceptance of those cultures, and also the acceptance of mainland China, of more mature Shanghai China, of Hong Kong China, of Singapore, in all the region around there, and how they were so hungry to learn how other parts of the world have made a success of what they did, and so receptive to your ideas. Even when you may have not been always 100% sure, their confidence actually helped. Yeah.
And what do you think was your superpower when it comes to entering all these different markets and industries that are considered to be quite rough and not easy to work with?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one, and you end up being self-critical. I think if you look at what you wasn't good at in those younger years, listening was never a strength. So I think that's something you certainly had to develop, and not just from the linguistic perspective where you had to understand. I remember going to Japan, and I spent a lot of time in Japan in those early years, and that was a very difficult business environment for a young man to be in. When I go back now with grey hair, that's absolutely fine. Respect comes with age. But then, you could have the right ideas, the brightest ideas, the most innovative solutions, but unless you'd commanded the respect of the one gentleman in the room that very rarely said anything, nothing would move forward. So I think, you learn to listen for sure, but I think also you need to be tenacious and never give up. If you believe in something and your moral compass, dare I say, is strong and it continues to point north, then having that tenacity to see it through, having that stubbornness, I suspect it would also be called. Not everybody may say so, but I think a little bit of stubbornness is not a bad thing.
I sometimes also reflect on the industry overall. It's almost like they are pushing you to train you to see, okay, are you still around? And then you get a little bit of a nudge and you're still there, okay. Then a little bit more, you're still there. And eventually it's like, okay, you're under your spot and let's see what we can do with you. But because there is that grit necessary also for the industry. And again, it comes from the past. In all these, if we speak about logistics, maritime, petrochemical industry, there I find similarities among them.
Yeah, it does, and I think that was almost crystallized for me when around about 2005. There was a big consolidation of many of the shipping lines through those years, and AP Moller Maersk, who at the time were one of our major competitors and organisations, they bought P&O Nedlloyd, and it was huge headlines, and as a management team, we were invited to Copenhagen to begin the integration. And of course, people were very worried.
Yeah.
They were worried for their jobs, for their livelihoods, for their careers. Who are these people? We are not the same people as they are. There was lots of possibly correct assumptions, but many incorrect assumptions. And I think coming from a very entrepreneurial organisation, as Nedlloyd certainly was, it was the Anglo-Dutch way of working together, into a very systematic, a very process-driven machine, such as Maersk was. Those early days were quite, I think, challenging on both sides. And I'd like to say that, again, the tenaciousness, the stubbornness of not only myself, but many of the team, I think ultimately softened some of the edges of the big blue maritime machine, made it more personable, made it more interacting with its clients, which it perhaps never felt the need to be before. And it's, many people say the same as what I would say. When you would go into a room with colleagues, new colleagues, you would introduce yourself, but following the introduction of yourself, it would be, I am X, Sealand, I am X.
Yes.
P&O, and that became almost a character, part of your character. Maersk, as you know, very, very data-driven, logical indexes, personality profiling. Again, that can tend to put people in boxes that they may never get out of. And I think certainly many of us at the senior level try to support the idea that, a square peg can fit in a round hole, providing it's supported. And I think, as a learning, that's good. That's good in life, to not always pigeonhole people in one area when they've got so many different facets you may not know anything about at all, until you actually give them the chance to expose themselves, give them the chance to fail within a controlled environment.
I also did observe, and I was told stories when I joined Maersk, how also when they started hiring tech people, that affected the culture of the company quite a lot. And
Yeah.
it is another example when some of these instances when companies are merged or where there's like a large number of people from certain company joining, it really changes things up and challenges it. And sometimes it's always rough at the beginning, right? They stir things up, but then when it settles, I believe that the number of perspectives that come together and that diversity then really makes nice quality work.
No, it does, and I don't think you get to be my age in the industry I'm in without having gone through several acquisitions. Ocean Group into eventually DHL, into Maersk, United Arab Shipping, the flagship shipping line for the Middle East, into Hapag-Lloyd. I worked for a small forwarder that became DSV. I managed a shipping line in Egypt that became Abu Dhabi Ports. So I think you see many similarities in success and many similarities in the perception of what will fail, depending on how people approach those integrations. I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't change it for the world.
I will now switch it up to a little bit lighter topic. If you were a vessel, which vessel would you be and why?
I think that's a really interesting one. And I don't know if this qualifies, but I'm gonna stick with what my heart tells me.
Yes.
I always had a dream that one day when I retire, whenever that may be, that I will find a small piece of beach somewhere warm. I like to be in the warmth, and I would just sit there with a bundle of jet skis and just let passers-by use them, and just spend my day watching people having fun on a small amphibious vessel, for want of a better term, that, they're fast, they're nimble, they love being in crowds around, groups of skis together with groups of people on. You never see anybody with a frown on when they're on a jet ski. Scared, yes, but full of energy, full of smiles. You're that close to the water, you're cruising through that water, you're splashing off the waves. They have the ability to get into places larger vessels can't get. They have the ability to lead the way. So yeah, whether it's a vessel or not, I don't know, but I'd be a jet ski, definitely.
That's so fun and an answer that I haven't had before.
Oh, we like to do things differently.
It also suits the previous conversation, how you enjoy the dynamics of Asia and also here.
Yeah,
So
I think so.
that's quite fun. How do you see the industry changing now with the aspect of decarbonization?
All right, if I didn't enjoy change and wish to be part of change and drive change and possibly crave change, you wouldn't be in this industry. You wouldn't be in logistics, you wouldn't be in supply chain, you wouldn't be in the maritime industry at all. I think that we don't see enough young people coming into the industry. That's just a fact, that's just a given. I was at conference this week, the Middle Eastern Bunkering Conference, and yes, there was a smattering of younger faces, 20-somethings, wide-eyed, but it was still by far a dark-suited, white-shirted environment. And that's a shame. It means we've failed. It means we've failed to encourage the youth to come into the industry, to see the fun that you can have, to see the people you can meet, to see the horizons you will cross. I think, again, many of the organisations have now integrated with other organisations. There are less opportunities, possibly, but much larger organisations, which means there's probably I think you mentioned a moment ago, more cost-effective staff recruiting happens, which isn't always, in more mature parts of the world. It can be in the third world. It can be in the lower-cost countries, and a lot of back-officing. Which then takes away the touch and the feel of the industry, but also of the client. And let's not forget, without the client, there is no industry. There's no requirement for shipping vessels or aeroplanes or warehouses or trucks without a manufacturer somewhere along the line to actually make that produce that needs moving. As I explained to my 4-year-old child when he came home from school once, or from preschool, "What do you do, Daddy?" "Oh, I move boxes around." "Like Lego?" "No, not quite like Lego, no." difficult.
Max and I had a discussion about this, and it was a topic also in each of the podcasts that I've done recently. And I do think it's a matter of visibility. But back to the discussion with Max, we were saying how this is one of the few industries where you can really travel everywhere, and it's the easiest to relocate. It's just the nature of work as well, oftentimes, because it's such a global business. And we now travel quite a lot because you have to, and it's wonderful to be able to somehow along the way experience much.
It's very true, and I think, if I look back just a handful of years when COVID closed the world effectively, people were starting to embrace Teams, Blue Jeans, Zoom. And I would smile as people would say, well, do you know how to use this? Well, we've had these applications on our phones, on our computers for 10 or 15 years. Because if you travel globally, you are still working. The work does not disappear just because you're on an aeroplane to somewhere, or you're in a hotel room, or you're bouncing between meetings. So, that international way of communicating and collaborating, both internally and externally, was always a way of living. That was always part of that. And I have to say, even after all these years, I don't travel as much as I used to, because again, my environmental bone twitches a lot if I travel too much, whereas it never used to. But I still do enjoy it. I still do get excited about it, and again I see it in my family. My eldest son's just about to start his role post university, and instead of starting straight away, he said, "I'd like to go travelling." And my instant reaction was, "No, start your career. Get your foot on the ladder." But for Dad, if I don't do it now, I'm never going to do it. So he went to South America for 4 months. And he came back with some wonderful stories and pictures and new friendships made, and his existing friends that came with him. Do you know what? Even at my age, I'm happy to be wrong. I was so wrong. He was so correct. So we're very privileged to be able to travel through work.
Yes.
Yeah, through work. Very privileged.
So I assume that he's not taking up a career in shipping.
No, he's going into banking with UBS.
Okay.
So he has the brains of the family, clearly.
Maybe he will get to sponsor some of the green projects.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe.
And how do you see the industry in this region of Middle East?
If I was passionate about Asia in the 2000s, there's nowhere else in the world I'd rather be right here as we hit sort of 2025 and onwards. There was a time when the Middle East was considered a backwater from a business perspective. If you wasn't in North America or in mainland Asia or in Europe, then nothing else in the world matters. And I think the Middle East tried so very hard to get a seat at that table. Until one day it woke up and it realised the table isn't big enough to have the Middle East sitting at it. So it built its own table. And now everybody else wants a table or a seat at the Middle East table. So, all of those passion, all of those energies, all of those learnings that we've seen over the last 25 years in not only in international transportation, but now in the environmental push, they're coming from here. And I say that, bizarrely as it may sound, but having lived in the Middle East for the last 11 years, having watched my children grow up here for the last 11 years, when I look to the finance sector to see how they're changing the finance sector, it's driven by the Middle East. When I look to some of the most successful companies in the world, Saudi Aramco is a great example, it's driven by the Middle East. When I look to decarbonization, Vision 2030, vision driven by the PIF and MBS in Saudi Arabia, the vision for Dubai as well, Vision 2050s, they are pushing the environment so heavily in almost everything they do, legislatively, but also in support of organisations. Who would have thought 20 years ago that, there'd be a biofuel company, the largest biofuel refinery now in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia. In Jubail, literally delivering pure net zero biofuel, almost zero carbon emission, not blended and touched by any other material than a waste stream collected in country for a product delivered in country for offshore power generation, for off-grid power generation, for vessels, for trucks. Who would have even perceived that? We have countries all over the world that don't even have that. They're still diluting their biofuels with a standard fossil diesel for whatever reasons they wish to come up with. So no, I think that I won't necessarily say the power, because it's not about the power, but certainly the vision and the ability to deliver on those visions is what makes living and work in the Middle East such an exciting place. And anybody that we ever visits here, or even this week at conference, they don't wish to go back to the aeroplane. They don't wish to head back to their home countries. And it's not just the sunshine, it's the business environment.
Yes, including some of us that I shared that extended the stay.
I think it's just conducive to success. I'd lived in Denmark for a few years when I was with APM, and I was talking to a gentleman yesterday, and he was saying that not only in Denmark, in Scandinavia, and certainly I know from the UK, that success is not always rewarded. It's not supported. It's not seen as a positive. In the Middle East, it is seen as a positive. You can still be humble and successful. There is nothing wrong with that at all. It does not need to be showy, but people will support you and applaud you for being successful. And if your business is successful, you're making other people successful. We are helping to decarbonize the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia just by what we do, which is a great thing in them achieving their vision. Yes. So, yeah, it's a great place to be.
And do you see the higher uptake? I would assume yes, and I would assume that there's a tilting point towards the positive uptake of biofuels due to the regulations.
Yeah, we do. I think the regulatory frameworks you have to work within clearly, and the thing with any fuel, as you'd recognise, is compliance. And we spend a lot of time at conferences where talking about compliance, talking about governance, and meeting not only existing regulations but the new regulations. The IMO came out in 2020 with maritime regulations. They refreshed them this year. From Jan 1, we have FuelEU, we have Fit for 55. And again, some of the numbers I'm hearing on the fines, on the tariffs that ship owners or charterers will receive by sailing into European waters, especially with non-compliant fuel, they're frightening. That the numbers are frightening, and that I can say that in an industry there's a multi-billion-dollar industry, these fines and tariffs are significant. And the point I think most of us made, and not just in biofuels, but in LNG, in ammonia, in all of the alternative fuels that are available, is that the maritime class systems have approved them. The maritime flag states have approved them. The registries have approved them. The OEM engine manufacturers have approved them. Why are people not using them as much as they could be using them? There is still a gap between approvals, legislation. I won't say availability, because anybody who knows the industry knows that they are pretty much available in quantity in most places in the world where they're required, but something is holding them back. Yeah. And I'm not quite sure I know the answer to what that is, not at this point anyway.
We also engage with some of the ship owners that have high exposure to penalties, and they're not using biofuels. And they said, no, we're not using them. It's not in our plan. We haven't tested it. I do think it's a cultural fear of new and fear of not knowing how to handle the unknown.
Yeah, I think it's almost more than that. And, as positive and passionate as I am about the maritime industry, change is just like a very old vessel. It steams in a straight line forever. It takes an eternity to change course. But once it changes course, it sticks on its new course. And I think for the maritime industry, the wake-up call is this year. The tariffs are now in place this year. There are mitigating factors, there are vessel pooling, there are carbon credits, there are as many different aspects by way they can look to mitigate some of these tariffs. But I think if any ship owner or charterer believes that they can operate as they did in 2024, without any change to their fueling regime, and not be subject to some of these tariffs, then they're absolutely fooling themselves. And I would say more than that, if they don't wish to do it for the environment, I guarantee you their customers will push them to do it. You know, we worked very successfully for many years with the likes of IKEA, the likes of Procter & Gamble, you know, real organisations that are bought into sustainability at a very, very senior level. And these are also the ones that are going to a Maersk, to a CMA, to a DHL, and signing long-term contracts with them for first mover advantage for sustainable aviation fuel, for biofuel or HVO for their vehicles, for a Maritime B30 blend for their container ships. So it's like anything, isn't it? If you don't embrace change, if you don't support what's going forward, whether you believe in the environmental impact or not, commerce will leave you behind. Your customers will walk away from you.
Yeah.
And that would be the saddest, because some great companies out there.
And also being able to see the opportunity in such moments of shifts. And if you had a crystal ball, what would you think the industry will look like towards 2050? If you were to paint a picture, and it's okay if it's not realistic.
I would be sitting on my beach looking at my jet skis running on biofuel, just to be clear, and watching the vessels passing in the background. Now, I don't know. Somebody asked me a very similar question the other evening on a panel, and part of what we do isn't just fuel, it's education. And often it's educating businesses and companies into options. But a lot of it these days is working with universities. So we work with the universities, we offer them tours of the refinery, we go in and talk to them at plenary sessions, and we try to instill that sort of energy into them that we have. And there is more energy in the environmental space, I think, than any other industry at the moment. People who are in it want to be in it for the right reasons. They care profusely about it, and they really want to make change for the right reasons, not to make their share owners potentially more money, but to support the environmental challenges that we've all, you know, seen and feel in many instances. So I think, you know, 2030 and beyond, the generation which is beyond me and is smarter than me, and is more passionate than I am, even if that's possible, they will come and they will help to fix some of the problems that we've created, and we've started to fix them. And I think by 30, it'll be widespread adoption of some of the fuels that people call alternative now. They will be standard. But I think as you go to 2040 and 2050, there'll be ideas that we've just never even considered. A gentleman said to me yesterday, you know, nuclear. Nuclear is a great way to power vessels. And I had to say to him, you must remember that my generation, we grew up with Greenpeace. We grew up with Chernobyl. We grew up with the remnants of Hiroshima. Nuclear was completely frowned on as unsafe and as bad as the worst of climate change. Now, of course, technology has changed. Governance has changed. Transparency has changed. With a view to that as a potential fuel. And he may be 100% right that in 50 years from now, all vessels will run on nuclear. He may be absolutely right, and they'll be perfectly safe. And in some respects, I hope it will, because it is a proven technology that we all know about. We just need to make sure that the safety guidelines are in place.
I asked this question because I'm curious to look back and see how close we've gotten to that. And now, stepping away from work.
Can we ever?
Yes. How do you perform at some of these executive roles as well? And also in an industry that never stops. Yeah. But how do you find a way to reset and maybe detach from it? What's the best way to do it?
Do you know, I think we're quite simple folks in general. I think it's an obvious one, but your family are your bedrock. And certainly for me, without the support that I've had from my wife over the last 25 years, is never I'd be able to do what I've been able to achieve, to work and live in different countries, to be away from home for weeks at a time. It would just be impossible. So, I think that's that's always the place where you go when you need to recharge. I think as a family, we like to do things together. We like to ski together. We like to holiday together. We like to spend time doing things together. I was fortunate enough to be a football coach when I was younger, and took my badges. And again, seeing those young children, the little eyes lighting up as you're teaching them new things, as they're learning new things, as they're building relationships with each other, but also with other parents, which is it's quite difficult for children growing up to actually be able to talk to an adult. I think all of those things were great in de-stressing, in relaxing us, in resetting us, is what I would say. Because I think if you can get, just one day a week where you can reset yourself, and I'm a huge believer in people taking their holidays and switching off, which is very, very difficult, we know, to do. You just come back with so much more power, so much more energy, so much more creativity. So yeah, I think doing things with the people that you love and who love you, doing things with the people that care about you, and can sense when you're on the edge of your frazzle. There can't be anything better than that.
Sounds like a very close-knitted and very enriching environment.
I think also, when you're in a different country which you didn't grow up in, you don't have necessarily your immediate family. Therefore, your friendship groups become your family. Yeah. Everybody would say and if you have an expat friendship group, some of those friendships are stronger than the ones you made in school, in university, in your early years. And again, one of the things in the Middle East that I found in working here since 2000, but living here since 2014, is it's absolutely right. Your friends do become your family, and they're always there to support you when you're not, if you're out of country, if something happens. You've got this network of people who ultimately are strangers when you first meet them. And again, they absorb some of the challenges in your life. They help you to get over their speed bumps. And again, they come with different cultures, different experiences, different recommendations, things that you would never necessarily hear growing up in your own small portion of the world.
Yes.
So we're very lucky, very lucky.
I can relate to this also as I was moving, just because of the new experiences. No one at home can relate to that. Yeah. And then these people understand the emotions, the challenges, and not necessarily just professionally, but even personally, as you're adapting to each of these places and trying to figure it out. So I can relate to that. Most of my close friends
very much so.
Came from programs.
Very much so.
At this point, I would like to pass you the microphone with the questions, and we can experience how it feels to ask questions and be interviewed.
I like the idea of this. Okay. All right. So one question. Magic wand.
Okay.
Okay. You have a magic wand in your right hand, and you have the maritime industry in front of you. What would you wish for to change today?
I would wish that people start openly taking out their side projects from the drawers and side thoughts on how things could be improved that have been waiting there for 10, 15 years, and just put them all out on some large table that they can accommodate, everyone, and they just talk through it and figure out multiple sets of great solutions, and to open the mind of how this can happen and how can we enable it more. Because I do think that there's still a lot of risk-focused discussions, and just like with everything else, if we always focus on the problems, then we will see more of them. Yeah. And I would love that, okay, we have now taken this whole bag of what can go wrong, but I would love them to focus on, okay, how can we make it right? What's necessary to change in order to make this work? And in my previous role, when I was driving innovation, I think eventually after pushing for different technologies, I realized that the key to success was creating this environment when people feel psychologically safe, that it's okay to bring their ideas, to challenge some ideas, and to foster this team spirit of, okay, how can we achieve this? And it's okay to be very ambitious.
I love that.
I love
absolutely love that. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, some of the best ideas come from the team members. Yeah, and to have that, I guess old school we used to call it the suggestion box, but to be able to offer those up in an environment of comfort, without criticism, with just praise. And you can imagine that you've come up with that idea and it actually comes to fruition. I mean, how wonderful is that for the individual that came up with that idea to begin with, no matter how beneficial it may be overall to the business. Great wish. Great wish.
Yes, I do think that in their sketches, there's so much experience. And sometimes people think, well, it's just something I was thinking about. But there are years of experience that constitute this drawing. And I would love people to believe their ideas more.
Brilliant. Very good.
Thank you for being my guest today. And I hope we get to meet again and in some time have a similar conversation again.
My pleasure, Gordana. Thank you very much for having me.